I'm Ali Velshi in Minneapolis. I want to continue the discussion of the role that history has played in the suppression of the socioeconomic and political progress of African Americans, which has played into this week's protests, not just here in Minneapolis, but across the country. The proximate cause of these protests was the death of George Floyd, and no one should lose track of that. But the fact is, there is a greater frustration. I want to bring in Jelani Cobb, who's a staff writer at The New Yorker. He's a professor of journalism at Columbia University and an MSNBC political analyst. I also want to bring in Nikole Hannah-Jones, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with New York Times Magazine for her work on the 1619 Project. She's also the co-founder of the Ida B. Wells Society. And Nikole received a Pulitzer Prize for her work on the 1619 Project. 1619 is when the first enslaved Americans arrived on our shores, Nikole. And no one can argue that much progress has not been made. But the argument that you made that won you this Pulitzer Prize is the argument that without black economic, without black political freedom, America did not have political freedom. Without blacks being involved in democracy, America, by definition, did not have democracy.
Absolutely. I mean, what we're seeing right now are black citizens demanding their full citizenship in this country. And there's a very long history of black people not being treated as human, as the belief that it was legal to kill black Americans. And we're seeing the manifestations of that right now. These protests are not about just one thing. They are about the disadvantages that black Americans face across the spectrum.
Jelani, let's talk a little bit about historical context. When Nikole talks about black Americans wanting their citizenship, that means a lot of things. That means social equality. It means economic equality. But really, this week, it's about my right to not be shot without a hearing for what it is I did. We don't really know yet what George Floyd was doing, but we do think it may have had something to do with a $20 counterfeit bill. I don't think there's anybody who believes he needed to die for that. In most cases, if you're a white-collar criminal involved in money, you don't even go to jail.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's very obvious that we have two completely different judicial and criminal justice systems in this country. That's not a revelation, but historically speaking, this has always been the issue. And as you astutely pointed out earlier, it is in the origins of policing, certainly in the American South, which was to reinstitute white supremacy after emancipation, and to find the roots of American policing there in the slave patrols that were tasked with preventing black people from escaping the institution of slavery into freedom. And so there's no shortage of examples when we kind of look at places in the Great Migration and the places where people went and the corresponding attempts of policing not to protect and serve, but to make sure that the geographic proximity of black people was never too close to white people. And so this is simply a descendant of the ancestral problem that we've had in this country from the outset of American policing.
Nikole, it's interesting because in totalitarian states, we understand that police are a tool of the government to control the people. But yesterday at one of the protests, maybe it was Friday, one of the protests, there was an African-American woman protesting in front of the National Guardsmen, and she kept on saying, "You work for us. We pay your taxes. You work for us. You need to protect us." And there doesn't seem to be a shared understanding that that's actually what police do for the African-American community. I think there are a lot of Americans who think police are public servants who work for them and are paid for by them. But to Jelani's point, that's not been a shared experience over the last 400 years or even the last 100 years.
It has never been the experience of black Americans that the police force has worked for us. The police force, as Jelani pointed out, was derived as a means of social control of black Americans. It continues to operate as a means of social control. If black Americans were policed the way that white Americans would be, they would not be in the streets right now. And I also think there's a sense on behalf of many police officers, not all, but many police officers, that they don't in fact work for black Americans. There's a belief on behalf of many Americans that black people aren't even taxpayers and are not not tax-paying citizens. So I don't think that the way that Black Americans see police as agents of the state who are supposed to be providing a service is the way that many police and politicians who deploy police into Black neighborhoods see them.
Jelani, the fact is that in some of these places, like we look at Ferguson, Missouri, and we realize there were no black police in a majority black city. Is part of this policing or is this policy?
It's both. And so we've had, if you go back, in the early part of the 20th century, I've talked about this before, where there were all these investigations trying to figure out why you had these uprisings. One of the things they kept saying was that they needed to diversify the police departments, that they needed more black officers and so on. And what you found is that this has made some improvement around the margins, but it certainly has not eliminated the problem in totality. And so this becomes a bigger policy issue. And the last thing I'll say about this is that it's very important to focus on policing, because policing is the spark that ignites these things. But for every one of these stories that I've covered, and I've covered a lot of these stories, it is always a complex of other socioeconomic dynamics. Nicole did outstanding work on the educational system in Ferguson. When you went to Ferguson, some of what they wanted to talk about was what happened to Michael Brown. A lot of what they wanted to talk about was the social services and institutions that were failing them there, the unemployment, the poor education, the poor housing, the quality of housing. And so policing becomes simply the trigger, what detonates a much bigger complex of social subordination.
Thank you to both of you. I implore my viewers to follow Jelani and Nicole on social media and read their really important writings on these topics. Thank you to both of you for joining me. Jelani Cobb is a staff writer of the New Yorker and a professor of journalism at Columbia University. Nicole Hannah-Jones is the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with the New York Times Magazine.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.